response and the environmental cleanup and the ongoing air, water, and soil testing after the tragic train derailment. And I want to thank my colleagues from across the aisle, those that have come to me and expressed their sympathy and their voice of support and asking if there's anything they can do. I appreciate the attitude with which you've embraced this disaster in my district. But I would like to request that my colleagues please refrain from using this evolving tragedy in our community, which is still being investigated on all fronts, to gain a political advantage in our debate today. This tragedy is far from over, and there will be a time and a place for a much-needed deep discussion on the incident, what caused it, the response, and the environmental cleanup that's resulting. But any effort to tie legislation we're looking at today to what happened in my district would be false and inaccurate because it's still an evolving situation. And it would be insulting to the people in rural eastern Ohio who are losing their businesses and who are still fearful to return to their homes. We're planning a subcommittee hearing with the EPA here and others at the end of March to give all members of our committee a better understanding of the East Palestine derailment and the state of the response and cleanup efforts. Even though we still have many questions, I am encouraged by the collaborative work of the Ohio EPA and the US EPA in our goal to reassure the people of East Palestine that this disaster will be cleaned up and that we will make sure those responsible are held accountable. With that, let's get to the important business before us today. And I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Welcome to the first markup of the 118th Congress for the Subcommittee on Environment, Manufacturing, and Critical Materials. This afternoon, our subcommittee continues the majority's efforts to unleash American energy, ease the burden of energy inflation for American families, and strengthen our critical supply chains. To do our part, we will be marking up a number of bills that address permitting and supply chain matters for laws under jurisdiction of our subcommittee. In particular, we are examining ways to ensure the regulatory landscape does not throw up insurmountable roadblocks for the processing and refining of critical minerals in the United States. This is a defining policy issue of the 21st century, and America must take the lead here. We also will take up 2 bills aimed at repealing particularly costly and burdensome provisions from the partisan so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which would raise the cost of energy for American families and businesses. Representative Pfluger's Natural Gas Tax Repeal Act and Representative Palmer's Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund Repeal Act would help reverse that damage. And if we actually want to lower greenhouse gas emissions at a large scale, I might add, I encourage members to support bills we heard about earlier today that would unleash American natural gas and LNG exports, which is proven to slash dependence on dirtier fuels overseas. So today we'll be considering H.R. 1070, introduced by Representative Carter, which is intended to give investment certainty to critical minerals processors and refiners. Mineral processing can be a waste subject to the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and a facility that stores, treats, or disposes of the waste on site needs a permit 180 days before physical construction of the facility can begin. H.R. 1070 grants a requesting facility that intends to process or refine a critical energy resource the status as an interim or Part A permit holder under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. The granting of this permit status does not absolve the interim permit holder of following the law. Moreover, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency or a state with delegated authority can review this permit to decide the permit status. We will also consider legislation introduced by Representative Pence, H.R. 1140. Some laws implemented by the EPA contain authority for the laws to be waived in the case of national security or to respond to gasoline shortages like those after a hurricane. As we heard during our legislative hearing, the Clean Air Act and the Solid Waste Disposal Act need to be updated to clearly foresee and articulate a defined response to both national security and energy security threats. This legislation, patterned after Section 202C of the Federal Power Act, provides clear authority to take necessary actions under the Clean Air Act and the Solid Waste Disposal Act to meet a national security or energy security threat when it comes to critical energy resources. In addition, we will also mark up legislation introduced by Mr. Curtis that addresses the backlog of new critical energy resource technologies in EPA's Chemicals Office. Under TSCA, the Toxic Substances Control Act, a maker of a new chemical or new use of an existing chemical cannot commercially manufacture until the EPA determines and regulates that risk. TSCA also requires EPA to make a decision in 90 days, but no more than 180 days, or face financial penalties. Unfortunately, the EPA reviews and decisions are operating at a snail's pace compared to both the Obama and Trump-era EPAs. The Curtis legislation eliminates EPA's incentive to drag its feet or make excuses. It prevents the EPA from asking people to voluntarily withdraw or suspend their innovations so EPA doesn't take a financial hit. The legislation also will require that the EPA holistically balance the risks and benefits of those innovations. Finally, we'll mark up legislation introduced by Representative Crenshaw. Mr. Crenshaw's bill addresses the Biden EPA's regulatory policy of every 5 years, imposing design and manufacturing process requirements on gasoline refiners that use hydrofluoric acid alkylation units. His legislation, which impacts 40% of domestic gasoline production and half of U.S. refining capacity, would not make these mandatory technology and alternatives assessments apply to currently permitted and operating plants. These kinds of assessments make the most sense at the design phase of a petroleum refinery. For new facilities, the legislation would permit these facilities to either comply with the EPA's technology and alternatives assessment regulation or demonstrate that the refining facility conforms to the domestic industry's most recent risk management standard. So with that, I thank the subcommittee members for being here today, and I yield any remaining time I have. I now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And shortly after the tragic incident occurred in your district, we communicated, and I again express my deepest sympathies to you and your constituents in East Palestine, Ohio. This type of accident should never happen in America, and you have my heartfelt commitment to work with you to understand the root causes, hold those responsible accountable, and work together to make certain that no community has to go through something similar in the future. I know there's a lot of work to be done to remediate the accident site and make residents whole. I think I can speak for all the members on our side of the aisle that we are here to be partners in the effort to examine whether EPA has the legal authorities and resources necessary to hold the responsible parties accountable. I also appreciate that you're moving these bills through regular order. However, I am disappointed that the concerns raised during the legislative hearing have not been addressed. Two of these bills, H.R. 1023 and H.R. 1141, would repeal important provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is critical to achieving the administration's Justice 40 goals. This fund will leverage private funding to make clean energy investments across the country, including in disadvantaged communities where financing such projects can be challenging. This program is important to ensuring the transformational benefits of our national clean energy transition reach all neighborhoods and are shared by all Americans. The methane emissions reduction program is going to drive down highly potent greenhouse gas emissions from the oil and gas sector, and it will do so by first providing funding to industry to adopt emission-reducing technologies. This approach is a good model for how we can work with industry to reduce climate pollution. Repealing either of these provisions would be a tremendous mistake, and I must oppose these bills. Several of the remaining bills would create new loopholes in our nation's most important environmental laws for a loosely defined group of critical energy resources. These bills are not going to enhance the safety of the air, water, and soil that our constituents rely upon. On the contrary, these bills are going to make it more, not less, likely that future contaminations will occur. Now, tragically, vinyl chloride, for example, the dangerous chemical at the heart of the East Palestine cleanup, is currently covered by EPA's risk management program. Under H.R. 1140, under consideration today, if vinyl chloride were determined to be a critical energy resource, facilities where it is produced may no longer need to reduce the risk it poses to workers in nearby communities. In fact, none of the Clean Air Act's requirements, or even state and local environmental laws, would apply to those facilities. It is important for us to remember why we have environmental protections in the first place. They were not created to prevent the United States from unleashing its fossil energy potential. They exist directly to protect communities and workers from dangerous pollution and industrial accidents. And every so often, the American public gets a tragic reminder of why these laws are necessary. The reality is there are people across this country who do not receive media attention, who live and work along the fence lines of polluting facilities. How can we tell them that we are going to allow those facilities to have a free pass to pollute so that fossil fuel executives can continue to line their pockets? We need to be very careful about creating new loopholes in EPA's authorities, and I am not convinced the language before us is solving any legitimate or pressing national energy challenges. The proposals before us today, I believe, are the wrong approach, but I do look forward to the discussion on these bills, and I hope that we can identify meaningful things that this subcommittee can do to better protect Americans from environmental threats and ensure polluters are held responsible for the damage that they indeed do. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the chair of the full committee, Chair Rogers, for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's great to advance our agenda through regular order. This markup builds on our work this morning in the Energy Subcommittee. We will consider an additional 7 bills for affordable, reliable, secure energy for all Americans. These solutions protect the environment, support energy expansion, and increase domestic manufacturing with reforms that reduce both cost and emissions. 4 of the bills today reduce regulatory red tape for critical energy resource facilities without compromising environmental protections. We know that the demand for critical minerals is expected to double by 2040, and these bills would support American jobs to meet that demand. For example, Mr. Carter's bill avoids years of likely delays under the Solid Waste Disposal Act, known as RCRA, for granting interim permits that are subject to EPA review. Dr. Joyce's bill requires the EPA administrator to review and update as necessary the flexible air permitting program, so it works better for critical energy resource facilities. Used by EPA since 2009, flexible permitting provides more predictability, timely permitting decisions, and ensures environmental protections. Mr. Pence's bill provides the EPA administrator a new and important tool to address shortages of critical minerals and energy materials that threaten national security or energy security. Mr. Curtis's bill addresses well-known delays by EPA in meeting legally required deadlines to approve new critical energy resources and uses new uses of existing critical energy resources. Streamlining permitting for critical energy resources is especially important, given these resources are, by definition, especially vulnerable to supply chain disruptions. As the Department of Energy assessment notes, China's control of key materials in renewable energy is across the board. 80% of rare earths production and refining that are the key drivers to wind turbines. 60% of lithium refining needed for EVs and battery storage, and 100% of processing for graphite in the battery anodes. We must work harder to reduce reliance on adversaries like China for critical energy resources. We need to remove unnecessary barriers to domestic production, processing, and refining. We cannot cede our energy leadership to China. 2 of the bills today repeal reckless spending provisions included in the Democrats' partisan rush to green reconciliation package. Mr. Pfluger's bill would lower energy costs by repealing the natural gas tax and rescind the remainder of the $1.5 billion in federal funding. It's the shale revolution that has driven down American emissions dramatically and strengthened our global standing by enhancing energy security. We should be leveraging our ingenuity to reduce carbon emissions, not picking winners and losers in the energy industry or making life more expensive for the hardworking people of this country. Furthermore, Representative Palmer's bill would repeal the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. This is really a $27 billion green bank slush fund that EPA is using to funnel taxpayer funds to banking and finance entities, which keep all of the proceeds. Transparency and accountability of federal funding is key to good government. This program was rushed into law with no accountability or oversight necessary for taxpayer stewardship. Finally, Representative Crenshaw's bill would protect American refining by addressing significant overreach by the EPA. Refineries are dependent upon the HF allocation, which represents 50% of total U.S. refining capacity, and preventing existing refineries from using this proven technology from operating would be detrimental to our energy economy. Our solutions today are a starting point to encourage energy expansion across the country. We must create an energy system in the United States that is affordable, reliable, and secure, while maintaining our high environmental standards to ensure clean air, water, and soil. And these bills do just that. By embracing abundant energy sources here at home, we can advance prosperity for American families, enhance our own security, and reduce emissions. I look forward to advancing this legislation before the subcommittee today to help us unleash American energy, lower energy costs, and strengthen supply chains. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlewoman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Representative Pallone, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson. With today's back-to-back subcommittee markups, Republicans are doing the bidding of big oil and gas companies and undermining our nation's bedrock environmental laws. My Republican colleagues say that these bills are needed to unleash American energy, but this could not be further from the truth, in my opinion. The 7 bills we're marking up today would keep us squarely in the past, stifle our progress towards a clean energy future, and endanger the health and safety of the communities we represent. It's regrettable the majority is attempting to rush these harmful policies out of committee, because I think the American people deserve better. Several bills allow so-called critical energy sources to bypass common sense environmental protections. H.R. 1155 would circumvent consideration of safer technologies to avoid chemical disasters under the Risk Management Program. H.R. 1158 seeks to amend the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA, and would undercut health protective policies that were developed and passed on a bipartisan basis by this committee in the Frank Lautenberg Act in 2016. TSCA is absolutely critical to protecting our communities from exposure to toxic chemicals, and it's very disappointing that Republicans are now looking to undermine the very law we all worked so hard to update 6 years ago. 3 bills would trade away public health protections to further subsidize polluting special interests. H.R. 1140 sets a dangerous precedent by allowing EPA to waive any Clean Air Act requirements, fees, or standards for a critical energy resource, and that's an unconscionable decision. H.R. 1070 would grant Solid Waste Disposal Act permits to owners or operators of critical energy resource facilities without requiring them to meet basic and necessary public health and environmental safety standards. And H.R. 1131 would automatically grant a flexible air permit to every industrial facility linked to critical energy resources, even those with abysmal track records of Clean Air Act violations and unfettered pollution. And all of these bills would put workers in communities at increased risk of harm. We should not be putting polluters over people by waiving critical public health and environmental protections that keep Americans safe. Today's markup also includes 2 bills to repeal programs enacted by the Inflation Reduction Act, programs that would reduce climate pollution, lower the deficit, and leverage private sector investment in clean energy projects across the nation. H.R. 1023 would revoke the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Program, which invests $27 billion in nonprofit state and local climate finance institutions to rapidly deploy low and zero emission technologies. H.R. 1141 targets the Methane Emissions Reduction Program, which provides incentives to drive down excess methane pollution and remediate the effects of the pollution that does occur. And as its core, this program ensures that polluters pay for wasted methane and not consumers. So I think these bills make it clear that Republicans refuse to hold polluters accountable for the damage they cause to our air, our water, our communities, and our climate. Democrats delivered historic wins for the American people by passing strong climate legislation that has already created more than 100,000 good-paying clean energy jobs, will cut costs for working families, and will ensure we lead the world in the transition to a clean energy economy. Republicans are actively working to undermine that progress and do the bidding of their polluter friends. So it's unfortunate that Republicans have not made any attempt to work with us on real solutions that will actually address energy security and affordability and can actually be signed into law. We should be working together to build a better future for all by investing in clean energy and bolstering our environmental safeguards. Instead, with these Republican bills, communities will be left behind and will be forced to continue to contend with the increasing harms from the climate crisis, toxic chemicals, and polluter malfeasance. And this is a dangerous path, and I urge my colleagues to reverse course. I oppose all 7 of these bills, and I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to do the same. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair reminds members that pursuant to the committee rules, all members' opening statements will be made part of the record. Are there further opening statements? Chair recognizes Mr. Joyce for 3 minutes for the purpose of an opening statement.
Thank you, Chair Johnson and Chairwoman Rogers, for holding this important markup. Returning to regular order is a victory for transparency in the legislative process and ultimately leads to stronger legislation that delivers for my constituents in Pennsylvania. The legislation that we are here to discuss today is critical as we face growing threats from our adversaries abroad. Reforming the energy permitting process is a vital step towards returning to energy dominance. Simply put, energy security is the needed national security. As we look to safeguard our nation's supply chains, protect our businesses, and defend American families, it is essential that we have the tools and the resources needed to produce and maintain the energy that our country needs today. Our ability to keep the lights on and keep gas in our fuel tanks is essential to our national success and safety. Sadly, the Biden administration has not shown that commitment to returning our nation to the energy dominance that we need today. The legislation being discussed here will help to reverse the energy trends that we've seen take root over the past few years. Instead of punishing or harassing our producers, we need to create greater access and spur investments in the resources that are under the feet of my constituents in Pennsylvania. Today's markup is a chance to return to regular order and return to energy policies that put Americans first. We know that by taking a serious look at permitting reform, we can pass legislation that supports our producers, brings stability to our markets, and lowers the cost for consumers. Now isn't the time to let our adversaries continue to make unmatched advancements. It's time to flip the switch and return to the energy dominance that we know is possible. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Ms. Barragan for 3 minutes for the purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have serious concerns about the Keeping America's Refineries Act, which exempts refineries using hydrofluoric acid from doing a hazard assessment or any assessment of safer technology options. In 2015, there was a near miss at a refinery near my district in Torrance, California. An explosion at the refinery launched debris that landed close to 2 tanks containing hydrofluoric acid. People could have been killed. In the last 20 years, there have been thousands of accidents and near misses at high-risk chemical facilities. Why would Republicans exempt refineries from critical accident prevention measures meant to keep our community safe? Instead, we should support EPA's efforts to minimize the risk of chemical accidents through their risk management program rule to prioritize prevention, worker safety, and transparency. I've led a letter with Senator Booker and 47 colleagues that outline specific improvements EPA can make to their proposed rule to minimize the risk of accidents. We need to take action to make our community safer, not more vulnerable to chemical disasters. This bill does the opposite. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The chair now are there any other opening statements? Okay, the chair now calls up H.R. 1070 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 1070, a bill to amend the Solid Waste Disposal Act to provide the owner or operator of a critical energy resource facility an interim permit under Subtitle C that is subject to final approval by the Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. and
Without
for other
objection, the
purposes.
first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. Are there bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there other amendments? The chair now recognizes Mr. Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to speak in favor of the legislation before us today that I've introduced to help America build again and make us truly energy independent. My colleagues across the aisle often say that the only way for us to be truly energy independent is to rid ourselves of the need of oil and gas and rely solely on renewable energy from solar and wind. I hate to break it to them, but that approach is simply making us more dependent on China. That is because all the new technologies required for solar, wind, battery power, and more all require significant critical and rare earth minerals. Despite being blessed with abundant natural resources of our own, we do not mine or process those here in the United States to meet our own demands. As we all know, China dominates the critical and rare earth space. Over half of rare earth minerals are extracted by China. If they're not extracted by China, they're extracted in countries with poor human rights and labor standards. Then almost all proceed are processed in China. China processes over 80% of the rare earth minerals in the world, nearly 60% of the lithium and cobalt. That is not energy independence. As I mentioned before, we have abundant natural resources that could help supply our demand, but permitting burdens hinder us at every step of the process. The U.S. is import reliant on 29 of the 35 critical minerals identified by the Department of Interior. Among these, the U.S. does not domestically produce 14 critical minerals and relies completely on imports to meet its demand for these minerals. We are headed for a crisis. We've already seen hints of it in recent years with rolling blackouts and brownouts in parts of our country and strained supply chains. I don't care if you say, drill, baby, drill, or never want to drive a gas car again. We need these critical minerals to meet our ever-growing demand for technology. Otherwise, we better get used to waiting months for products to get onto our shelves or lots and rolling blackouts when it gets too hot or cold. That is not acceptable by the American people. That is why I'm proud to sponsor H.R. 1070 to provide some permitting relief for critical energy resources like the mining and processing of critical minerals. Permitting challenges and delays have contributed to significantly disincentivizing investment in these crucial areas. Right now, we are facing a significant shortfall between the demand for critical minerals and what is even planned to be mined. My bill will get rid of one hurdle for those seeking to mine or process critical minerals by providing for an interim permit for hazardous waste that is stored, treated, or disposed of on site. This is a signal to industry and market that we are serious about onshoring our supply chain. For better or worse, we've made the financial commitment. Now we need to back it up by actually facilitating building projects in the U.S. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or ARRA, requires anyone who owns or operates a facility where hazardous waste is treated, stored, or disposed of to have a Resource Conservation and Recovery Act hazardous waste permit issued by the EPA. The permit application is divided into two parts, Part A and Part B. Unfortunately, this process can take years to be finalized, delaying projects. My bill allows for an interim permit while the application is considered, allowing critical energy projects to move forward without being held hostage by the EPA or delegated state authority. Importantly, projects with an interim permit should still have to follow relevant and applicable environmental laws and standards. They are not free of regulation and still must be good stewards of our environment. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, allow America to build again, and end our critical mineral dependence on China. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Do other members want to speak on the bill? The gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to strike the last word. I'm concerned with the drafting of H.R. 1070, which would exempt the owner and operator of any, and I quote, critical energy resource facility from needing to obtain a permit for the treatment, storage, and disposal of hazardous waste. Hazardous waste is hazardous for a reason. These materials pose immense risks to public health and the environment, which is why Congress enacted laws to ensure they are treated, stored, and disposed of safely. This bill includes vague definitions and a complete lack of review and accountability. It relies heavily on the term critical energy resource, a term that, as far as I'm aware, is not used anywhere else in law. Frankly, I still do not have a complete understanding of the universe of what critical energy resource could include. I have reviewed EPA's list of hazardous wastes under RCRA, and I am concerned any or all of them could be covered by the definition of critical energy resource. Before we vote, it would be very useful for the subcommittee to get a clear picture of which listed wastes constitute critical energy resources and which, if any, do not. For example, mixed radiological waste is on the list. As I read this bill, mixed radiological waste could be considered a critical energy resource. So, if enacted, EPA could grant waivers from the rules that ensure safe disposal of radiological wastes. I would be hard-pressed to find any constituent of mine who would support allowing these radioactive wastes to be transported, stored, or disposed of without any oversight. I expect most other members would feel the same. There are other significantly concerning wastes that appear to fall under the broad definition of critical energy resource, including wastes from explosives and pesticide manufacturing. I only mentioned a few, but there are hundreds, if not thousands, of dangerous wastes that could be exempt from common sense environmental and public health requirements if this bill is enacted. Exempting dangerous materials from our bedrock environmental laws will not do anything to lower energy prices, no matter how many times members might claim so. It is clear this bill could use additional input from stakeholders. If the majority's cause is as straightforward as they say, to lower energy costs and strengthen our energy security, there should not be any problem with making certain we get this policy right. And that starts with trying to identify what specific problem we are trying to solve and what narrow universe of so-called energy resources may need to be covered. But allowing the Secretary of Energy to have such broad discretion to define these resources and undermine EPA authorities is unacceptable. I urge my colleagues to oppose this legislation. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any other members that wish the gentleman recognizes the chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Allen, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word to speak in favor of Representative Carter's legislation, H.R. 1070.
Gentleman's recognized.
We have said that permitting reform is necessary to reshoring manufacturing in America and building our domestic supply chains. It is alarming that China is a world leader in extracting and processing critical materials. Mr. Carter's bill, H.R. 1070, takes a step forward in assuring investors that putting their money into new American manufacturing is not a lost cause. This legislation will cover owners and operators of 4 types of critical energy resource facilities: new and unconstructed facilities, new facilities subject to the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, for the first time permitted facilities with newly regulated units, and interim status facilities. Under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, a mineral processing facility that generates RCRA-regulated waste needs a permit if it does one of 3 things: stores the waste for 90 days, treats the waste, or disposes of the waste. This permit must be applied for 180 days before physical construction of the facility can begin, and no facility can operate without a permit. I understand that RCRA permitting process can take years to be finalized. Under the Carter Bill, a facility that processes or refines critical energy resources can apply for and automatically be given an interim permit, helping provide some level of assurance to an investor. This Carter Bill would jumpstart construction and domestic investment and is limited to facilities that process or refine critical energy resources. It helps rebuild our supply chain and doesn't short-circuit environmental protection. I urge support for this bill, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any other members? The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson. I oppose the underlying bill, and I don't think the amendments make it any better. H.R. 1070 amends the Solid Waste Disposal Act, which regulates the treatment, storage, and disposal of hazardous waste to allow owners or operators of vaguely defined critical energy resource facilities to operate without meeting any protective public health or environmental standards. Now, as drafted, the bill is very broad, does not appear to focus on only energy-related industry, despite the use of the term critical energy resource, and the facilities eligible for an interim permit would include those that manage radioactive waste, petrochemicals, fertilizer, mining waste, just to name a few. These are not facilities that we want operating without necessary permits. This legislation could enable the release of harmful pollutants into our air and water, threatening the environment and health of our communities nearby. Environmental justice communities, those commonly at the front lines of these facilities, would undoubtedly be disproportionately impacted by the bill. A specific concern I have with the bill is that the scope of the waivers granted to the owners or operators of these facilities by the EPA administrator appears to be egregiously far-reaching and all-encompassing. Under the language of the bill, it's unclear to me whether an entire facility can be granted a waiver from hazardous waste regulations if just one part of the facility processes a so-called critical energy resource. Further, if the so-called critical energy resource is just one of many hazardous waste processed at a facility, would this bill potentially waive safeguards for all of the hazardous waste it processes? And these are important clarifications that I believe need to be addressed. The bill also omits any safety or worker protection requirements at these critical energy resource facilities. I understand that my Republican colleagues are interested in working on securing our energy supply chains and lowering energy costs. However, this bill is simply a handout to big polluters. It would do nothing to strengthen our energy security and would put our communities and the environment at serious risk from management of hazardous waste. So I think we owe it to our constituents to take the time and work together and get this policy right. Unfortunately, this legislation is a step in the wrong direction. I urge my colleagues to vote no on the bill. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Do any other members wish to speak on behalf of the bill?
Got an amendment whenever you get ready.
Are there amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1070, offered by Rep. Carter, and the matter proposed to be added as paragraph 4 of Section 3005E of the Solid Waste Disposal Act. Amend subparagraph A to read as follows.
The reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this is not a complicated amendment at all. It's a perfecting amendment, and I hope it is one that everyone can support. This amendment changes the definition of critical energy resource to align it with the other bills we are marking up today that use that term. After this bill was first introduced, it was discovered that the definition could be sharper about what the Secretary of Energy is determining regarding an energy resource. This amendment makes clear that the Secretary of Energy is determining that an energy resource is essential to the energy sector and energy systems of the United States, and the supply chain for this energy resource is vulnerable to disruption. There's nothing more to it than that. Quite simple. I urge support for this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment? There's no further discussion. The vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. All those opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 1070 as amended to the full committee. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to.
Mr. Chair, can we have a roll call on the vote?
A roll call has been requested. The clerk will report the roll.
Rep. Carter. Rep. Carter votes aye. Rep. Palmer. Rep. Palmer votes aye. Rep. Crenshaw. Rep. Crenshaw votes aye. Rep. Joyce. Rep. Joyce votes aye. Rep. Weber. Rep. Weber votes aye. Rep. Allen. Rep. Allen votes aye. Rep. Balderson. Rep. Balderson votes aye. Rep. Fulcher. Rep. Fulcher votes aye. Rep. Pfluger. Rep. Pfluger votes aye. Rep. Miller Meeks. Rep. Miller Meeks votes aye. Rep. Obernolte. Rep. Obernolte votes aye. Rep. Rogers. Rep. Rogers votes aye. Rep. Johnson.
Johnson votes aye.
Rep. Johnson votes aye. Rep. Tonko.
No.
Rep. Tonko votes no. Rep. DeGette. Rep. DeGette votes no. Rep. Schakowsky. Rep. Schakowsky votes no. Rep. Sarbanes. Rep. Clark. Rep. Clark votes no. Rep. Ruiz. Rep. Peters. Rep. Peters votes no. Rep. Barragan. Rep. Pallone. Rep. Pallone votes no.
The clerk will report the result.
Chair, on that vote, the ayes were 13 and the nays were 6.
The amendment is agreed to. Are there any further amendments? Having heard none, the question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 1070 to the full committee. The ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. The chair calls up H.R. 1131 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 1131, a bill to require the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency to authorize the use of flexible air permitting with respect to certain critical energy resource facilities. And
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point. Does anyone seek recognition? I recognize myself at this point. First, I want to again thank Chair Johnson and Chairwoman McMorris-Rogers for holding this subcommittee hearing today so that we can go through these bills in regular order. These pieces of legislation are vital to our nation's interest, and we should take the time to hold hearings, markups, and ultimately pass bills through committee in the way that the founders of this institution envisioned. This process produces thoughtful, sound, and well-written statutes that the American people can be proud of, and H.R. 1131 is a great example of why regular order is so important. This legislation gives critical energy resource facilities the ability to participate in the flexible air permitting program, giving facilities the flexibility to plan for anticipated operational changes, such as increased market demand for products or dramatic shifts in supply. This is already existing EPA program that has been used by companies under both Republican and Democratic administrations to increase the production of critical energy resources. Intel, for instance, was able to use the program to successfully build a much-needed semiconductor fabrication plant in Oregon. Congress should make sure all critical energy resource facilities have that exact same opportunity. We've heard this repeatedly, how this committee and how China's mineral dominance is a threat to our national security. China controls substantial portions of the mineral supply chain and nearly 90% of processing for rare earth elements. Whether it's our electric grid, advanced manufacturing, or the phone that's in your pocket, Chinese minerals have become pervasive in the products that we use each and every day. Energy security is national security, and the only way for the United States to counter the potential for foreign economic interference is to jumpstart domestic production. We have the resources beneath our feet, but we need to spur investment in unleashing their potential. The roadblock that American industry has been running into is, unsurprisingly, regulations. Government delays, backlogs, and indecision have caused projects to wither on the vine. We cannot expect to build the needed capacity for critical energy resources while continuing to hinder new development. Now, environmental regulations are important, and this bill does not lift requirements, but rather allows entities the opportunity for permitting certainty by giving every critical resource facility the chance to fully participate in the flexible air permitting program. H.R. 1131 will provide that certainty. Facilities with flexible, market-responsive operation in 5-year permits would cut the cost, the time, and delays associated with permit approvals. The benefits of these permits provide are clear regulations, the ability to grow, and assurance that operations meet environmental standards. America has the capability to increase the production of the minerals that we need for a new modern economy. America has the potential to lead the world in resource development and to bring back manufacturing jobs in new sectors of our economy. To do this, we need to get private capital off of the sidelines. H.R. 1131 is a step in the right direction so new projects can receive the financing that they need. For too long, regulations have scared off investment in desperately needed sectors. We saw recently with the supply chain issues caused by the pandemic how easy it is for our economy to be disrupted by shortages. The only way to guarantee American access is to utilize American resources. U.S. industry, from mining operations to processing facilities, is ready to take up the mantle. By merely giving the private sector more regulatory certainty, we will be going a long way to breaking China's iron grip on critical minerals and reclaiming American energy dominance. I urge all of my colleagues to support H.R. 1131. Thank you. Does anyone else seek recognition? Mr. Tonko.
Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word.
So recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. H.R. 1131 would require the EPA administrator to authorize use of flexible air permitting for critical energy resource facilities. As we have already heard, the definition of a, quote, critical energy resource facility is extremely broad and can cover almost any type of industrial facility. In 2009, the EPA finalized a rule allowing for the use of flexible air permitting with the goal of providing greater operational flexibility while ensuring environmental protection and compliance with applicable Clean Air Act requirements. Specifically, a flexible air permit contains approaches that allow the source to make certain types of operational changes without further review or approval by the permitting authority. These permits are considered and granted by states and EPA on a case-by-case basis and include specifications and terms and conditions for each unique facility. The use of flexible air permitting certainly makes sense in certain scenarios. Unfortunately, we have witnessed grave abuses of a flexible air permit. A recent example of these abuses is at the Limetree Bay refinery in the Virgin Islands. After being shuttered for almost a decade, the Trump administration granted this troubled facility a flexible air permit, allowing it to reopen, continue to operate, increase pollution, and evade stricter air pollution controls. Despite this sweetheart deal from the Trump administration, the company refused to comply with simple tasks like air monitoring. The Biden EPA yanked the flexible air permit when a malfunction just a few days after the refinery restarted sent oil droplets showering through the air across, and a series of chemical releases into the environment sickened nearby communities. The Lime Tree Bay Refinery is a prime example of why flexible air permitting cannot be a one-size-fits-all process, granted automatically. Applying blanket flexible air permitting across all critical energy resource facilities without considering their specific circumstances would indeed put our constituents and the environment at serious risk. Critical energy resource facilities can encompass a wide variety of processing and manufacturing industries, each with different polluting profiles and permitting requirements. Flexible air permits need to be considered on a case-by-case basis, as each facility is in a unique position. It would be reckless and dangerous to force the EPA administrator to haphazardly grant flexible air permits to every so-called critical energy resource facility without due consideration required by our Clean Air Act. As drafted, this bill is far too broad and could put public health and welfare of communities surrounding these facilities at tremendous risk. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this legislation, and with that, I thank you, Mr. Chair, and yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone seek recognition? The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Allen, is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word to speak in favor of Representative Joyce's legislation, H.R. 1131.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
As mentioned earlier during this markup, permitting reform is an area of focus this Congress. To secure our critical energy resources, we must look for ways to ensure our current permitting process does not have redundancies that delay permitting. I am voicing my support for Representative Joyce's bill, H.R. 1131, which provides flexibilities in the air permitting process for critical energy resource facilities. This bill is straightforward as it allows critical energy resource facilities to get upfront approval on any changes to emissions, instead of having to have those changes approved at the time they occur. This bill authorizes requirements from the 2009 final flexible air permitting rule, which was actually authorized and finalized by an Obama EPA administrator. Operational flexibility for critical energy resource facilities is a step in the right direction towards securing our supply chains. I urge support of this bill, and with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Are there any amendments to the bill? Question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 1131 to the full committee. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. The ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to.
Recorded vote, please.
The gentleman asked for a recorded vote. The clerk will report the roll.
Rep. Carter. Aye. Rep. Carter votes aye. Rep. Palmer. Rep. Palmer votes aye. Rep. Crenshaw. Rep. Crenshaw votes aye. Rep. Joyce. Rep. Joyce votes aye. Rep. Weber. Rep. Weber votes aye. Rep. Allen. Rep. Allen votes aye. Rep. Balderson. Rep. Balderson votes aye. Rep. Fulcher. Rep. Fulcher votes aye. Rep. Pfluger. Rep. Pfluger votes aye. Rep. Miller-Meeks. Rep. Miller-Meeks votes aye. Rep. Obernolte. Rep. Obernolte votes aye. Rep. Rogers. Rep. Rogers votes aye. Rep. Johnson.
Johnson votes aye.
Rep. Johnson votes aye. Rep. Tonko.
No.
Rep. Tonko votes no. Rep. DeGette. Rep. DeGette votes no. Rep. Schakowsky. Rep. Schakowsky votes no. Rep. Sarbanes. Rep. Clark. Rep. Clark votes no. Rep. Ruiz. Rep. Peters. Rep. Peters votes no. Rep. Badagan. Rep. Pallone. Rapalone votes no. Mr. Chair, on that vote, the ayes were 13 and the nays were 6.
Adopted. The chair now calls up H.R. 1140 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 1140, a bill to authorize the Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency to waive application of certain requirements.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. Are there anyone wish to speak on behalf of the bill? Mr. Joyce from Pennsylvania is recognized.
I wish to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I again want to thank you, Chairman Johnson and Chairwoman McMorris-Rogers, for holding the subcommittee markup so that we can go through these bills in regular order. It's great to consider legislation in the way that it was designed. As I mentioned before, it would be impossible to serve on this committee and not understand the threat that China's domination of the mineral supply poses to the United States. Lithium, nickel, copper, cobalt, you name it. China has a prevailing stake in the global market. The Chinese have not only made massive strategic investments in mining, but also in processing, and now control nearly 90% of the processing for rare earth elements. If we're serious about competing with China, we must do more than talk about the threat and the need to expand domestic production. We must give both the EPA and private industry the tools that they need in order to jumpstart America's production capacity. And that's what H.R. 1140 is intended to do. This legislation, sponsored by Representative Pence, authorizes the administrator of the EPA to temporarily waive requirements necessary to allow for the processing or refining of a critical energy resource to meet national security or energy security needs. It empowers the EPA administrator with a tool to respond to supply disruptions or related spikes in demand that threaten national or energy security. As witnesses have testified before in front of this committee, the United States is entering the most mineral and metal-intensive era in human history, and much of this demand for these materials relates to the advanced energy systems. The EPA administrator needs the capability to address critical shortages for minerals and other energy materials through increased domestic production. H.R. 1140 would allow the administrator, in consultation with the Energy Secretary, to determine the processing or refining of a critical energy resource at a facility, and if it is necessary for national security or energy security. This bill would then authorize the administrator to issue a temporary waiver from the Clean Air Act or Solid Waste Disposal Act requirements that they judge are necessary to allow production to meet those security needs and ultimately serve the public interest. H.R. 1140 has been updated from the draft bill based on feedback at a legislative hearing to establish requirements and a public interest protection by which the administrator must act to avoid or minimize any adverse environmental impacts of a temporary waiver. The bill now incorporates statutory language already enacted by Congress in Section 202C of the Federal Power Act that has been used successfully to address electricity supply emergencies. We all know that the pandemic taught us a tough lesson on how easy international trade can be disrupted and for supply shortages to affect our economy. We need to learn from that experience and understand the vulnerability that this could cause. These minerals are used in every aspect of our modern society, from the power grid to batteries, phones, and cars. They are called critical for a reason. And without them, many of the items that we use and consume every day would be impossible to manufacture. The fact is, domestic production should be a bipartisan issue. If my friends on the other side of the aisle are serious about energy transition, then we need huge amounts of these critical energy resources to do it. As of now, any move in this direction would leave the manufacturing and energy sectors of the American economy at the beck and call of the Chinese supply chains. And I don't believe that any lawmaker wants to put the economic future of their constituents in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. This is why we need to look at the future and protect against possible disruptions that could threaten the American way of life. We need this bill to provide an important tool for the administrator to allow production of critical energy resources to serve the public and provide for national and energy security needs. That is why I urge all to support H.R. 1140. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Do others seek recognition? The chair recognizes Mr. Pallone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, H.R. 1140 has changed since our legislative hearing earlier this month. The memo from the majority describes the changes to the bill as adding, and I quote, new language that establishes requirements, timeframes, and a public interest protection by which the administrator must act to avoid or minimize any adverse environmental impacts of a temporary waiver. That's the end of the quote. Well, I have to respectfully disagree with this sunny characterization by that quote. First, one of the new changes removes public access to the permitting process by removing opportunities for notice and comment for the permits in this bill. Second, counter to the public interest, this legislation exempts facilities that receive waivers from citizen suits, allowing polluters to avoid accountability and hide from any public, financial, or legal obligations they may leave behind. And finally, the bill creates a new giant loophole for polluters. So long as a polluter can make the case that they are a so-called critical energy resource facility, they can violate any and all environmental laws without any legal consequences. So these changes are textbook examples of putting the needs of polluters before the American people. The changes to this bill are drastic, substantial, and simply are not supported by the testimony presented to the subcommittee. And I don't consider blocking community input or setting back basic environmental protections by decades to be a minor change to legislation. The consideration of every bill in today's markup has been rushed without any consideration of the consequences for the communities we represent. And the changes included in H.R. 1140 are worthy of further discussion in a legislative hearing. So I urge my colleagues to vote no on this bill, and with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Do others seek recognition? The chair recognizes Mr. Palmer for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
And I want to thank Congressman Pence for bringing this bill forward. According to the United States Geological Survey, the United States gets around 80% of its rare earth imports from China. China dominates the supply chain worldwide, having about 37% of the proven reserves and produces 63% of the global output. They house 85% of the processing capacity. An Australian company operates the only non-Chinese separation plant, and it's located in Malaysia. Back in 2019, the United States produced about 12% of the global rare earth supply at its Mountain Pass mine, but the ore has to be shipped to China to be upgraded into compounds and products that are then shipped back to the United States. So I think it becomes painfully clear that we find ourselves in a very difficult position in regard to rare earth minerals and critical minerals that we're going to need, particularly as we continue to advance renewables. The interesting thing is that the Mountain Pass mine that produces U.S. production of rare earth elements, Mr. Chairman, is partially owned by China. So I think some of the concerns that my Democrats colleagues have about this, particularly on the permitting side and the potential for pollution, I don't see any contradiction between expedited permitting and being able to access these critical minerals and still maintaining the environmental quality that we have all come to expect. So I would urge my colleagues to support this amendment because I think it's a national security and an economic security issue for the United States to produce, to mine, refine, and manufacture its own rare earth materials. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Do any others members seek to speak on the bill? Are there any amendments, bipartisan amendments? Any amendments? The question now occurs on the forwarding of H.R. 1140 to the full committee. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. The ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to.
Mr. Chair, I call for a recorded vote, please.
A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Rep. Carter. Rep. Carter votes aye. Rep. Palmer. Rep. Palmer votes aye. Rep. Crenshaw. Rep. Crenshaw votes aye. Rep. Joyce. Rep. Joyce votes aye. Rep. Weber. Rep. Weber votes aye. Rep. Allen. Rep. Allen votes aye. Rep. Balderson. Rep. Balderson votes aye. Rep. Fulcher. Rep. Fulcher votes aye. Rep. Pfluger. Rep. Pfluger votes aye. Rep. Miller Meeks. Rep. Miller Meeks votes aye. Rep. Obernolte. Rep. Obernolte votes aye. Rep. Rogers. Rep. Johnson.
Aye.
Rep. Johnson votes aye. Rep. Tonko.
No.
Rep. Tonko votes no. Rep. DeGette. Rep. DeGette votes no. Rep. Schakowsky. Rep. Schakowsky votes no. Rep. Sarbanes. Rep. Clark. Rep. Clark votes no. Rep. Ruiz. Rep. Peters. Rep. Peters votes no. Rep. Badagan. Rep. Pallone.
Have any members not been recorded?
Ms. Rogers is not recorded. Ms. Rogers votes aye.
Any other members not recorded? The clerk will report. Sorry. How does Mr. Pallone recorded?
Rep. Pallone is not recorded. Rep. Pallone votes no.
The clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on that vote, the ayes were 13 and the nays were 6.
The bill is agreed to. The chair now calls up H.R. 1158 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 1158, a bill to amend the Toxic Substances Control Act with respect to new critical energy resources.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. Does anyone seek recognition to speak on the bill? Gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to strike the last word to speak in favor of this legislation.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, during this legislative hearing, former Deputy Energy Secretary Menzies made this important point. Department of Energy employees told him the technologies we will need to take us into the future have not been invented. I want my colleagues to think about that for a second. The future energy security of our country has not even been invented yet, let alone commercialized. This is especially true for new emissions technologies that Democrats claim to want. We need a system that prevents unreasonable risk, but we also need one that doesn't work so hard to remove any risk that society suffers, our economy suffers, our environment suffers, and we all suffer. We need balance. As a pharmacist, I know the importance of balance and avoiding unreasonable risk. Whenever someone picks up their medicine, there's a statement with their prescription that says, your doctor has judged that the benefit to you is greater than the risk of side effects. Many people using this medication do not have serious side effects. Essentially, if you don't want side effects, don't take any of your medications. But if you want to improve your quality of life, taking the risk isn't unreasonable. It's the same choice we have for our future energy needs in bringing our domestic supply chains home to America. H.R. 1158 focuses the same unreasonable risk approach to critical energy resources that the Department of Energy has determined are essential for the energy sector and energy systems and for which the supply chain is vulnerable to disruption. In other words, if you believe reducing carbon emission is imperative, like I do, you don't want energy shortages and you want American workers to own that future, this bill will make that happen. This bill would not prevent EPA from considering risk to human health and the environment. This bill will not prevent EPA from looking at unreasonable risks to potentially exposed and susceptible populations. The bill uses the federal government standard for pesticides but applies it to critical energy resources. It does prevent myopic regulatory stringency, the kind of no-risk perspective currently at EPA that threatens deindustrialize America and threatens our high standard of living. We need to balance risks, not avoid them, and proceed when the benefits are greater. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield the remainder of my time from the gentleman from Texas.
I thank the gentleman from Georgia, and I agree with the gentleman about wanting to protect risk, but also about not going overboard and ignoring practical, rational considerations. There is no commercialization of new technology until the EPA signs off on it. This is why I support the other items in this legislation, items that wouldn't be necessary if the EPA did its job. The bill prevents EPA from proactively asking a new technology maker to suspend or withdraw their application unless EPA has reviewed their notice and preliminarily found an unreasonable risk. Under the law, the EPA must refund the user fee to an applicant if EPA misses its review deadline, and the ability to withdraw or suspend the review of a new chemical or new use is a regulatory option that lies entirely within the submitter of a notice. The language essentially prevents EPA from bullying an innovator into stopping the clock on EPA because EPA just didn't bother to take their notice seriously. And EPA can keep the money. It's the worst of both worlds for the submitter. It's who's worried about retaliating, quite frankly. This language doesn't hurt reviews. If EPA does not have enough information, it can order that information be given to it. If EPA needs more time to review it, they should have reviewed the notice just to justify asking for it. The other provision I support is making the law's deadlines real ones. The 90-day and 180-day deadlines are not suggestions. They are requirements we expect EPA to obey. Unfortunately, EPA has become expert at excuses for why they're getting worse, not better in meeting those requirements. As Mr. Wahlberg recently pointed out, he and Michigan Democrats intervened with the White House because advanced battery technology was being held up in the review process. We cannot have investment in new manufacturing avoiding America because the only predictably regulators provide is that they will be unpredictable. EPA should not be compensated for poor performance, nor rewarded for paralysis by analysis. They should meet the law's deadlines without intimidating others. I urge support of this legislation. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Does anyone else seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, the gentlewoman from New York, Representative Clark.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Recognized.
I cannot support the gentleman's bill. If passed, this bill would pose serious risks to the health and safety of communities across our nation. In 2016, Congress passed the Frank Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act with overwhelming bipartisan support, including unanimous support from this committee. I'm deeply disappointed that my Republican colleagues are now working to roll back these reforms. As part of the Lautenberg Act, Congress strengthened the EPA's new chemicals program, requiring the EPA to make a determination on each new chemical before it enters the market. H.R. 1158 essentially allows approvals of new chemicals by default, no matter how toxic, pervasive, or harmful to our communities. Under this bill, new chemicals that are deemed a, quote, critical energy resource, end quote, would be allowed into our homes and communities without any determination of their safety. Current law also expressly prohibits the EPA from considering costs when determining the risks associated with the chemical. Instead, the EPA can consider such non-risk factors when the EPA manages the risks it identifies. But determining risk should be based on the impact to public health, not companies' bottom lines. The bill we are considering today would completely erode these public health protections, reverting back to a broken system that will undoubtedly put families and workers at risk. I would also like to ask this committee to consider, when we prioritize economic considerations over public health, whose health are we sacrificing? Who bears the burden of pollution when a nation is built on environmental injustice? Make no mistake, there's no need to sacrifice health protections from toxic chemicals in exchange for a clean energy future. If Republicans really want to speed up reviews, they should work with the Democrats to ensure the EPA has the staff and resources they need. A GAO report released earlier this month found just that. Inadequate staffing was the key reason EPA has missed review deadlines. I remain committed to working with my colleagues on this committee to build on the progress we've made last Congress in building a clean energy economy while protecting public health, centering equity, and protecting the most vulnerable among us. Unfortunately, my colleagues seem more interested in gutting the current chemical review process and endangering the well-being of workers, fence-line communities, and consumers. I strongly oppose this bill and encourage my colleagues to do the same. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Is there anyone else who seeks recognition? The ranking member from New York, Mr. Tonko.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have serious concerns about the gentleman's bill and therefore must oppose it. The Elimination of Future Technology Delays Act would endanger the health and safety of workers and consumers. The Lautenberg Act was passed with overwhelming bipartisan support under Republican leadership here in the House. Members of this committee may remember that I had concerns with that bipartisan agreement at the time, and I ultimately opposed it. But despite my concerns, I have not sought to undermine the bipartisan efforts included in this bill, because I fully acknowledge that our nation needs a national working chemical safety program. Unfortunately, I believe this bill goes against the spirit of the compromise that many Republicans on this committee supported in 2016. The Lautenberg Act made several key reforms to TSCA, including strengthening the new chemicals program so that chemicals would no longer enter the market without EPA review and appropriate regulation. The bill before us today would erode these public health protections in an attempt to speed up reviews for critical energy resources, which could allow harmful chemicals to enter our homes and our communities. The legislation requires the Department of Energy to deem a new chemical to be essential. It is unclear how new chemicals will be classified as essential by DOE. Will we send new chemicals to DOE for review before EPA begins its own review under TSCA? Certainly, that will not result in faster reviews. If my colleagues really want to speed up reviews, they should join Democrats in advocating for more resources for EPA's Chemicals Office. We must ensure that the agency has the resources and the staff it needs to address the increased workload that Congress created as part of the reforms. I oppose this legislation and indeed urge my colleagues to do the same. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? Hearing none, the question now occurs on forwarding. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any other amendments? Hearing none, the question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 1158 to the full committee. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. The ayes have it.
Mr. Chair, I call for a recorded vote,
A
please.
recorded vote is so ordered.
Rep. Carter. Aye. Rep. Carter votes aye. Rep. Palmer. Aye. Rep. Palmer votes aye. Rep. Crenshaw. Rep. Crenshaw votes aye. Rep. Joyce.
Aye.
Rep. Joyce votes aye. Rep. Weber. Aye. Rep. Weber votes aye. Rep. Allen. Rep. Allen votes aye. Rep. Balderson. Rep. Fulcher. Rep. Fulcher votes aye. Rep. Pfluger. Rep. Pfluger votes aye. Rep. Miller Meeks. Rep. Miller Meeks votes aye. Rep. Obernolte. Rep. Obernolte votes aye. Rep. Rogers. Rep. Rogers votes aye. Rep. Johnson. Rep. Tonko.
No.
Rep. Tonko votes no. Rep. DeGette. Rep. DeGette votes no. Rep. Schakowsky. Rep. Schakowsky votes no. Rep. Sarbanes. Rep. Clark. Rep. Clark votes no. Rep. Ruiz. Rep. Peters. Rep. Peters votes no. Rep. Badagan. Rep. Pallone.
Is anyone not recorded who wishes to vote? Mr. Balderson?
Mr. Balderson is not recorded. Mr. Balderson votes aye. Mr. Johnson is not recorded. Mr. Johnson votes aye.
Mr. Pallone?
Mr. Pallone votes no.
Are there any others who wish to be recorded? The clerk will now report.
Mr. Chair, on that vote, the ayes were 13 and the nays were 6.
The bill is agreed to. The chair now calls up H.R. 1141 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 1141, a bill to repeal the natural gas tax, be enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled. Section 1, short title. This act may be
Without
cited-
objection, the first reading of the resolution is dispensed with, and the resolution will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. Does anyone seek recognition? Mr. Pfluger from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to strike the last word.
So ordered.
Over the last 2 months, this committee has prioritized hearing from American energy producers on the impact of the administration's policies and what they have actually, how they've impacted operations, local economies, and America's overall energy security. When hearing testimony in both Washington, D.C. and in Midland, Texas, independent oil and gas producers, not big oil, but independent oil and gas producers who produce 83% of America's oil and supply 90% of our natural gas supply, spoke with their concerns about the natural gas tax included in the 2022 Democratic Inflation Reduction Act. Prior to the passage of the IRA, there was no congressional hearing, there was no expert testimony, there was no economic analysis on the first ever tax on GHG emissions. However, rough estimations projected the fee in resulting in an annual cost between $39 and $65 billion and as much as $337 million in fees per facility. Yet, it would only reduce GHG emissions by 2.6%. In fact, increased production of natural gas has lowered both prices and emissions. In 2019, economists estimated that the shale revolution reduced domestic price of natural gas by 63% and led to a 45% decrease in the wholesale price of electricity. This, in turn, saved U.S. consumers $200 billion annually. That is the equivalent of $2,500 for a family of 4 annually. Between 2005 and 2019, CO2 emissions from the U.S. power sector declined by almost 30%, with the generation of power from natural gas accounting for more than half of that said decline. According to the EPA, emissions declined 31 million metric tons from 1990 to 2017 in CO2. And over the same time period, natural gas production also rose 51%. Companies are highly motivated to capture methane to the best of their ability by market forces. This is why companies voluntarily invest millions in the development of new technologies and innovations that can better detect or reduce methane emissions. This program will instead reduce the available capital companies have on hand to voluntarily invest in these projects and instead direct that money to an EPA bureaucracy that will inevitably do what it does best and slows down the production of affordable, reliable energy. The natural gas tax follows Democrats' narrow energy logic. Fossil fuels produced in the U.S. by American workers are bad, but fossil fuels produced in places like Iran and Russia and other foreign actors are good. The world is not in a transition. We are in an energy expansion. And I'm pleased that this committee is marking up my legislation, H.R. 1141, to repeal the Democrats' natural gas tax and lower costs for every American. This tax will impose financial burdens on independent producers. Remember, independent producers who produce almost 90% of America's oil and natural gas, and it's 83 to 85% of independent producers, not the big oil that we hear so much about. This is the tax that will hurt them and therefore consumers. And it will add another layer of complexity to small businesses and divert their attention away from what they should be doing, which is producing American-made energy. Additionally, the methane tax would add the burden of moving EPA into tax collection. I want to stop for a second here and just point out a couple of things about that. This is the first time that the EPA would be in the tax collection business. It's the first time that the EPA is looking at things like collecting taxes, and nowhere in the EPA statutes do they have, I believe, that authority. Another couple of technical issues here. When you read through the natural gas tax, you have two different measurements. One is weight and one is volume. Volume is what we sell gas in. Weight is what they're taxing it on. And when you read through the Clean Air Act and you read through Section 136, it's extremely confusing. $900 in 2024 for a ton, $1,200 for a ton in 2025, $1,500 for a ton after 2025. The EPA doesn't even know how they are going to actually administer this tax, how they're going to calculate it, and what a facility is, whether it's your onshore or offshore facilities for production, whether it's pipelines, and how they actually administer it. Mr. Chairman, I'll close with this. This is a poorly thought out, disincentivizing, and actually more harmful to the environment tax that does nothing to reduce GHGs and actually will cost Americans every by incentivizing production overseas and disincentivizing that production here. With that, I urge a yes vote, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Does anyone else seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Peters from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Recognized.
I'm very proud of the transformational climate investments programs in the Inflation Reduction Act, especially the methane emissions reduction program. It builds on the Environmental Protection Agency's existing greenhouse gas reporting program, recognizes the cleanest performers, holds individual companies responsible for their own leaks and wasted methane pollution, drives innovation in the sector, creates good-paying jobs, and supports projects to protect American communities from the effects of the climate crisis. But all of that would be in jeopardy because of H.R. 1141, which would repeal the program. And I want to say to my friend from Texas who hosted us at a great hearing in Midland, and we were wonderfully taken care of, and it was very hospitable, that I would commit to work with you to deal with some of the administrative issues around taxing from EPA. I think those issues are well raised and they are concerns, but I don't think that getting rid of the program is the right thing. I think fixing the program together in a bipartisan way is something that I would be willing to do. But just because I want to just make sure we've thought this through, The Clean Air Act, Section 135, has two distinct components. First, the appropriations. And I asked the council if the council knows how much the statute provides for incentives for methane mitigation and monitoring. Are you aware of that?
I'm looking for in the statute, so,
I'll help you.
yes.
It's $850 million.
850 million.
Okay, from FY '22 to '28. And again, I was going to ask you, but if I'm wrong, you can tell me because I don't want to use too much time. For methane mitigation incentives for conventional wells, it's $700 million. And I want to be sure everyone understands that $1.55 billion in funding will go a long way to help the oil and gas industry with reducing current and legacy methane emissions. So in good faith, I want those independent producers to be able to access that money to get the help that they need for compliance. Now, the other distinct component of the program is the emissions charge, which, if I ask council the revenue of Section 135 in the Clean Air Act, it would be a CBO estimate of $6.35 billion from 22 to 31. Since the program will continue to charge for wasted methane beyond the 10-year budget window, the methane emissions reduction program is estimated to raise even more. So Section 135 of the Clean Air Act actually cuts the deficit as well, and repealing the provision would, as a corollary, increase the deficit. I think we're all concerned about that as well. But I just want to say again to Mr. Pfluger, I hear you on we're charging the agencies to do a lot more things than they've done in the past with the infrastructure bill and with the IRA. And I think your concern about whether those will be carried out well is fair. And I think, as part of oversight, whether Republicans or Democrats were in charge of the House in this term, we would be talking about how that significant amount of money is going to be deployed. And I just want to pledge to you that I'm happy to work with you to fix it, to make sure that it works well, to make sure that your operators get the assistance they need to comply, which was the intent, but I'm not willing to repeal it. And so,
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, in our hearing, and thank you for the debate for the first time, I think, in a couple of years. The IRA, we didn't have the opportunity to talk to producers. We didn't have the opportunity to have these hearings and actually go through the facts about how the EPA is not a taxing agency, shouldn't be, and that's what my constituents are saying to me. And in the hearing, the field hearing we had in Midland, Texas, I think what we all heard was that there's not a single company out there that's not worried about methane. They're all worried about methane. First and foremost, because they're worried about their profit. Second, they're worried about reducing what they already know the Clean Air Act has been for decades doing and trying to reduce. And let's state the fact here, for the past 10 years, methane emissions have been reduced because of industry work and innovation by almost 15%. That's an enormous cut without being incentivized or disincentivized. So
if I could reclaim my time to respond. I hear you. This should have been bipartisan from the beginning. I've been to Houston 3 times. I've been to Midland twice. I've been to Lubbock. I'm traveling to deal with methane because I acknowledge that natural gas can be around for a while. Whatever politicians might say, it's going to be decades. I just want it to be cleaner. That's what I ask of the industry, and that's why methane is so important to me. So let's continue to work on it. And I think to the extent we could do it in a bipartisan way, Mr. Pfluger, I think it would be better for everyone. So we didn't get that in the last, Democrats have had to carry this. I've invited Republicans to work with me on methane, and I hope you will. I think we're all incentivized to do that now, and I look forward to getting this exactly right. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Does anyone else? The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Balderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to strike the last word.
So ordered.
Thank you. Over the past 2 years, this administration's energy policies have led us down a dangerous path, a path that would make us more reliant on foreign countries, empower our adversaries, cancel American jobs, and drive up costs for consumers who are already feeling the pinch of high inflation. Restoring the American energy independence and security is crucial to maintaining our country's role on the world stage. Is uniquely positioned as a leader thanks to an abundant supply of natural gas, which can power the country and has already reduced CO2 emissions from Ohio's power generation by 38%. New fees and taxes on American energy producers, small energy producers, raise costs for customers at the worst possible time and create a burden that disproportionately hurts low-income Americans. I'm proud to support this bill, which would repeal the Inflation Reduction Act's natural gas tax. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Does anyone else seek recognition? The gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. Deguette.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
So ordered.
H.R. 1141 would repeal the methane emissions reduction program under the Clean Air Act. And regrettably, since my friend is the sponsor, I really strongly oppose this legislation because I think this really reverses our policy. Methane has a warming capacity that is 80 times greater than carbon dioxide. 80 times greater. So research has shown that more than half of the warming that we're going to have over the next 20 years will be from the continued release of methane and other short-lived pollutants due to current emissions. Now, we all know climate change is responsible for driving extreme heat and weather events that turn into significant public health impacts. And so we have to work to limit methane emissions immediately if we really want to effectively tackle climate change, protect public health, and ensure the planet remains habitable for our children and grandchildren. Combating methane pollution also provides critical protection for millions of people across the country, like alongside the gas industry, is one of the most immediate and cost-effective ways to slow the rate of global warming, while at the same time improving air quality and protecting public health. And so I've worked hard to reduce methane emissions in Congress, and I was really happy that the methane emissions reduction program was enacted through the Inflation Reduction Act last year. Now, some industries, my colleague is correct, some industries have in fact worked to control methane. In fact, controlling methane emissions from the oil and gas sector, it shouldn't be a partisan policy. BP and Shell support the direct federal regulation of methane emissions. But however, both of them said that won't cut emissions fast enough. So what we need is a national standard to cut these emissions. We can't just rely on some industry participants reducing methane on their own. And that's why this program is a very good program, because it introduces a charge on methane emitted by oil and gas companies that emit over 25,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent a year and exceed applicable waste emissions thresholds. Now, some people say that this will raise costs for the oil and gas industry, but in fact, as several of my colleagues, including Mr. Peters, have mentioned, there's significant funding provided for the companies to come into compliance. The program provides $1.55 billion to fund and provide technical assistance to accelerate emissions reduction from petroleum and natural gas systems. So everybody can benefit from this, not just companies like BP and Shell. So to be clear, the legislation not only repeals the program, but it also repeals the funding that would have gone to systematically control methane emissions. And so for that reason, I really think this legislation is a step in the wrong direction, out of sync with the realities of air pollution and energy production. And so I feel quite strongly that we should oppose this legislation. We can work together, as Mr. Peters says, to find some way to oversee the subsidies that are going out and the taxes and so on. But simply eliminating the law is the wrong way to go. And I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition to speak on the bill? Are there any bipartisan amendments?
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I move to strike the last word.
Absolutely. The gentleman's recognized.
Okay, now it may be a little inserted and not on topic, but I reserve my right to strike the last word and make a statement in asking for unanimous consent. To make this statement for the record, I am concerned by the bills this subcommittee is considering today. These bills will roll back our nation's bedrock environmental laws like the Clean Air Act, Toxic Substance Control Act, and the Solid Waste Disposal Act that vulnerable communities depend on would be weakened under these bills. This is the wrong approach and a false choice. Frontline communities already bear the unfair burden of environmental injustice. As a doctor, I've seen firsthand that we need to do more, not less, to protect environmental justice, frontline environment, help our attained with the select Subcommittee on COVID, of which I'm ranking member, and thus my absence during these votes, I would have voted nay on the bills considered today. So I thank you, and I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 1141 to the full committee. All those in favor, say aye. All those opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it, and the
Mr.
resolution
Chair,
is
I
agreed to.
Call for a recorded vote, please.
A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Rep. Carter votes aye. Rep. Palmer. Rep. Palmer votes aye. Rep. Crenshaw. Rep. Crenshaw Allen votes aye. Rep. Balderson. Rep. Fulcher. Rep. Fulcher votes aye. Rep. Pfluger. Rep. Pfluger votes aye. Rep. Miller Meeks. Rep. Miller Meeks votes aye. Rep. Obernolte. Rep. Obernolte votes aye. Rep. Rogers. Rep. Rogers votes aye. Rep. Johnson.
Johnson votes aye.
Rep. Johnson votes aye. Rep. Tonko.
No.
Rep. Tonko votes no. Rep. DeGette. Rep. DeGette votes no. Rep. Schakowsky. Rep. Schakowsky votes no. Rep. Sarbanes. Rep. Clark. Rep. Clark votes no. Rep. Ruiz. Rep. Ruiz votes no. Rep. Peters. Rep. Peters votes no. Rep. Barragan. Rep. Pallone. Rep. Pallone votes no.
How's Mr. Balderson recorded?
Rep. Balderson is not recorded.
Aye.
Rep. Balderson votes aye.
Are there any other members not recorded? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on that vote, there were 13 ayes and 7 nays.
The bill is agreed to. The chair now calls up H.R. 1023 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 1023, a bill to repeal Section 134 of the Clean Air Act relating to
Without
the
objection,
greenhouse-
the first reading of the resolution is dispensed with, and the resolution will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. Do any members wish to speak on behalf of the resolution? The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, is recognized.
I thank the chairman, and I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My bill to repeal the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is a great opportunity to right some of the wrongs that were in the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. While our constituents are suffering under the weight of inflation, Congress should not have established this $27 billion slush fund for green advocacy groups. For almost a decade, climate alarmists have advocated for a national green bank to fund the rush to green. This idea wasn't popular enough to pass it in standalone legislation, so in pure Washington, D.C. fashion, it was stuffed into the 700-page Inflation Reduction Act and jammed through Congress. Meanwhile, more and more Americans with less means are being pushed into energy poverty by these left-wing energy policies. Energy prices have risen so much during President Biden's administration that nearly 20 million American households, about 1 in 6, are behind on utility bills, according to the National Energy Assistance Directors Association. But there's other problems. These funds, the way these funds will be used, will result in more economic displacement that only adds to the economic problems caused by the wrong-headed Democrat and Biden administration policies. These are policies that are undermining our economic security, and I would argue, and I think many people would agree, our national security. As I pointed out at the Markup hearing earlier today, the modern world depends on 4 things: cement, steel, plastics, and fertilizer. As a result of the cutbacks in energy and the changes in energy policy that we've experienced in the last few years, we're losing these energy-intensive industries to China. China now produces 61% of the world's cement, 50% of the world's plastics, 31% of the world's plastics, and 50% of the world's steel. All of which is needed for the construction of turbines and solar arrays. The bill reminds me of what people are going through, forcing people in some places to choose between buying adequate, that has pushed these policies in Europe and in the United Kingdom, where we're now seeing something attributed to excess winter deaths, where they're now estimating anywhere from 6,000 to 9,000 people are dying in the wintertime in the UK because they can't afford to adequately heat their homes. This is not made-up stats. This is a scandal over there. Even the left has acknowledged this, Mr. Chairman. And it's because the government is funding this mad rush to energy policy. In Germany, their electricity prices are 3 times higher than the U.S. average. They're twice as high in the UK. We've seen a reduction in residential energy consumption in the UK of 10%, and it's not energy efficiency, it's because they can't afford it. So here we are looking at a $27 billion slush fund with various advocacy groups that will be involved, and banks and administrative costs and Lord knows what else that they're going to be pushing that are going to further undermine affordable energy for the average American household. I think it will do enormous harm to low and middle income families, and will do nothing to increase our economic security or our national security. So I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and hopefully we can get to a point where we can actually be bringing some sensible energy policy before Congress. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Do other members seek to be recognized to speak on the bill? Are there any amendments? Ms. Schakowsky
I
is
have an
recognized.
amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
SCD 2.
Amendment to H.R. 1023, offered by Rep. Schakowsky. Page 2, line 2.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would ensure that communities have the opportunity to be able to do what they need to do, and instead what this legislation does is repeal the greenhouse gas reduction fund. Really disappointed that we're doing that. Specifically, it would the greenhouse gas reduction fund would actually ensure that the legislation does not go into effect until the administrator of the EPA certified $27 billion appropriated to the greenhouse the greenhouse gas reduction fund. At least $15 billion of that will support disadvantaged communities. And this, what they can do is so very, very important. This funding will provide the ability of these communities to develop clean energy programs in those communities and to spur economic growth. And you know, we are talking about communities that have been the most impacted by climate change and have suffered the most from the pollution and the harm in their communities. So if the fund is repealed, these communities will actually be robbed of more sustainable future. They will continue to deal with the problems that they have been facing disproportionately in their communities. And so this seems like such an important investment that we are making in communities all over the country. They said that while a good portion of it is going to disadvantaged communities, it's going to help all communities really to be able to develop their own programs to make their communities safer, cleaner, their economies better in those. I think that repealing the greenhouse gas reduction fund is a real mistake, and those of us who represent constituents who are working day and night to be able to make their communities cleaner and better, I think they would be very disappointed to know that the funding that will go to help them is not going to be available. So with that, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment?
Mr.
The
Chairman,
gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
I'd like to be recognized to speak in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman's
To
recognized.
strike the last word. The amendment effectively negates the underlying bill by granting the EPA administrator the authority to choose the implementation date, which could be as late as after all the greenhouse reduction fund dollars are already expended. H.R. 1023 repeals the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is important as EPA does not have the capacity nor the expertise on capital formation to properly manage the fund. I would argue that the EPA has been one of the more destructive agencies in the federal government in regard to the impact on capital formation. The EPA is not managing fund, it's just serving as a conduit to the green bank industry. You know, my colleagues across the aisle keep referring to big oil, but isn't this really just a largesse for big green, with the profits taken off from the backs of the taxpayers? I think that it's also an issue of duplication. Separate from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, the Inflation Reduction Act included billions of dollars in direct grant funding, as well as tax incentives for special bonuses for projects located in low-income communities. So this argument that this is going to somehow benefit low-income communities, I think, doesn't carry water. So I think that the argument for this is not substantive for this amendment. I think that we can make a better argument that we need to be investing in the full range of energy sources, whether it's renewables. The market should make that determination, let the consumers decide what's best for them. But setting up this green bank to push green energy policies on our economy, I think is going to have the same debilitating impact that it's had in other places, particularly in Europe, with the same negative consequences for low and middle income families, including those who are literally choosing between buying their medicine and buying their food and being able to adequately heat their homes. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back. I urge my colleagues to vote no on the amendment.
The gentleman yields back. Any other members wish to speak on the amendment? Chair recognizes Mr. Pallone for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. To actually try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, then the climate crisis is only going to get worse. And I know that the other side is suggesting, well, you know, you shouldn't pick or choose between different energy sources. But there's no question certain energy sources, fossil fuels, for example, certainly have the tendency when they burn to create greenhouse gases. I mean, the science tells you that. Now, there may be some way to capture that through carbon capture, whatever. I'm not arguing that that's not something we should look into. We should. But we have to do something to reduce greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Otherwise, the climate crisis is going to get worse with all the consequences for people's health and the environment. So when we initiated this Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, it's basically designed to help state, local, and nonprofit entities to deploy low and zero emission technologies. And a certain percentage of that is supposed to target environmental justice communities or disadvantaged communities, because we know that in many cases they've felt the brunt of a lot of pollution, industrial pollution, other types of pollution in the past. And our Republican friends know that the federal government often leverages federal dollars with private sector investment to create jobs and to do other positive things. So why not do the same thing when you're trying to reduce greenhouse gases or reduce the impact of climate change? I frankly think that this Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is one of the most significant investments to address climate, and arguably one of the most significant investments to just eliminate something like the Greenhouse Gas Fund, that come up with some way of trying to use the fund or influence the process in a positive way. But right now, instead of working to address the climate crisis, my Republican colleagues are essentially living in the past, that more handouts for overly subsidized oil and gas industry is okay, but not help to try to move in the opposite direction towards renewables. I don't see anything that they've suggested today in either of these markups that actually helps move us towards clean energy. It's just not one of the things that they're focusing on. And if you don't do that, there's a cost. The cost is of clean air, the health of American families, good paying clean energy jobs, and frankly, our future if we don't address this. So look, climate poses a real threat to our country and to the world. And I'm just deeply disappointed that, that I can't make an argument to the other side that's based on the fact that we're trying to reduce greenhouse gases or address the climate crisis. And that's what I think this is. This is just, this underlying bill is basically saying that we're not going to make an effort in that regard because we don't think it can be handled properly. Well, if you don't think it can be handled properly, then come up with a different way to handle it, but don't just get rid of it altogether. That's a very negative attitude towards our future and towards trying to deal with the climate crisis. So again, I think that Ms. Schakowsky's amendment will certainly help this, but the underlying bill should be opposed. And with that, I yield back, Mr. I yield.
Gentleman yield.
I yield to the gentlewoman from Illinois.
So I think the beauty of this fund is that it allows local communities to innovate, to come up with the kind of, because it's a grant program, to come up with ideas that are going to address the particular problem within their own communities, and to set the priorities that they want in their communities. And I think that this is a real advance to not set rules that apply everywhere to everyone, but to create a fund that communities, and again, also particularly communities that are have special needs, to be able to do what they need the most in their own communities. It's not a slush fund by any means. We should do it. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Does the gentleman yield? It's your time, Mr. Pallone. Do you yield back?
I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else wish to speak on the bill or the amendment? Mr. Tonko is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I speak in support of Representative Schakowsky's amendment. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund will provide historic investments in clean energy, helping the United States reduce its greenhouse gas emissions and meet our climate goals. In particular, the fund will be a transformative investment in the lives of so many Americans, especially our underserved communities. And let's be clear, that includes many, many rural communities. This fund will reduce pollution, create good-paying jobs, and promote economic development, which would improve the health and the livelihood of American families. And I find it unbelievable that members would support repealing this section of the Inflation Reduction Act without any real plan to address climate pollution and support communities carrying the brunt of the climate crisis. My colleagues are clearly in denial over the real threat climate poses to the health of families and the security of our nation. This amendment will ensure that these communities are not left behind, enabling disadvantaged communities across the country to share in our healthier, more sustainable future. So I urge my...
All those opposed, nay? Nay.
Mr. Chair.
The ayes have it.
Mr.
And the
Chair, I call
amendment.
for a roll call, please.
A roll call vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Rep. Carter. Rep. Carter votes no. Rep. Palmer. Rep. Palmer votes no. Rep. Crenshaw. Rep. Crenshaw votes no. Rep. Joyce. Rep. Weber. Rep. Allen. Rep. Allen votes no. Rep. Balderson. Rep. Balderson votes no. Rep. Fulcher. Rep. Fulcher votes no. Rep. Pfluger. Rep. Miller-Meeks. Rep. Miller-Meeks votes no. Rep. Obernolte. Rep. Obernolte votes no. Rep. Rogers. Rep. Rogers votes no. Rep. Johnson.
No.
Rep. Johnson votes no. Mr. Weber is not recorded. Mr. Weber votes no. Mr. Tonko.
Yes.
Rep. Tonko votes aye. Rep. DeGette. Rep. DeGette votes aye. Rep. Schakowsky. Rep. Schakowsky votes aye. Rep. Sarbanes. Rep. Clark. Rep. Ruiz. Rep. Peters. Rep. Peters votes aye. Rep. Badagan. Rep. Badagan votes aye. Rep. Pallone. Rep. Pallone votes aye.
The clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on that vote, there were 6 ayes and 11 nays.
The chair also wishes to clarify that the noes had it on the voice vote as well, but the amendment is not agreed to.
And for other purposes.
I beg your pardon. We got to back up. The question now occurs on the forwarding of H.R. 1023 to the full committee. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. All those opposed, say no. The ayes have it, and the resolution
Mr.
is
Chair,
agreed
I
to.
call for a recorded vote, please.
A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Rep. Carter. Rep. Carter votes aye. Rep. Palmer. Rep. Palmer votes aye. Rep. Crenshaw. Rep. Crenshaw votes aye. Rep. Joyce. Rep. Weber. Rep. Weber votes aye. Rep. Allen. Rep. Allen votes aye. Rep. Balderson. Rep. Balderson votes aye. Rep. Fulcher. Rep. Fulcher votes aye. Rep. Pfluger. Rep. Miller-Meeks. Rep. Miller-Meeks votes aye. Rep. Obernolte. Rep. Obernolte votes aye. Rep. Rogers. Rep. Rogers votes aye. Rep. Johnson.
Aye.
Rep. Johnson votes aye. Rep. Tonko.
No.
Rep. Tonko votes no. Rep. DeGette. Rep. DeGette votes no. Rep. Schakowsky. Rep. Schakowsky votes no. Rep. Sarbanes. Rep. Clark. Rep. Ruiz. Rep. Peters. Rep. Peters votes no. Rep. Badagan. Rep. Badagan votes no. Rep. Pallone. Rep. Pallone votes no. of gasoline and prevent higher prices for consumers and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. Does anyone wish to speak on the bill? Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw is recognized.
Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for putting together some of these great bills. So I want to talk about this, what it does, why it matters. Because from some of the comments about this bill, you would think it's the end of all regulatory oversight on refineries as we know it, and this is not true, of course. Regulations and standards governing U.S. refineries are some of the strictest in the world, but this EPA seems to believe the following faulty logic, that if one regulation is good, then 10 more must be better. Now, truthfully, they're taking aim at all things fossil fuel and the things that Americans rely on. And my bill simply seeks to put a stop to a highly unnecessary EPA rule that frankly came out of nowhere and for no good reason. So I want to explain what the EPA did and why it doesn't make sense. This rule requires companies to provide what's called a safer technology alternative analysis, which of course sounds innocuous, but the EPA wants refineries to assess the feasibility of replacing specifically hydrofluoric acid alkylation units, a very typical unit for refineries to use, with something else. They don't say what. The reason the EPA wants companies to conduct this reporting is because this administration, at the urging of radical environmental groups, believes hydrofluoric acid alkylation units pose a safety risk. Now, to comply with the safety requirements in the rule, according to at least one report from Becht Engineering, refineries really only have one option, which is to swap their alkylation units with sulfuric units, which is the only other commercially viable alternative. Now, the cost of that would be billions of dollars, plus refineries would have to shut down their operations for up to 3 years to make the change. So how many refineries would this affect? Nearly 50 active refineries use hydrofluoric acid alkylation units, and that produces about half the country's gasoline. So that's 50% of all refining capacity. So the footprint of this rule cannot be overstated. In fact, at a recent hearing before this committee, when we talked about this issue, former Deputy Secretary of Energy said we shouldn't ever want to imagine a scenario where we lose 50% of our refining capacity, and yet that's exactly what the proposal is. So at a minimum, in the best case scenario, this proposed rule would be a paperwork exercise and a total waste of time for companies. And the worst case scenario is refineries go offline for 3 years, pay billions of dollars to comply with the rule, which we know that cost will get passed on to consumers and the Americans we all represent. Everyone's talking about how dangerous hydrofluoric acid is and that it's too risky for refineries to use it. But let's think about something. What's the only other alternative? Sulfuric acid. Not exactly something you'd want to go shower in. The CDC says excessive exposure can result in death. Any exposure is destructive of skin, eyes, teeth, and lungs. Sulfuric acid alkylation units need 3 times the space and 3 times the frequency of delivery as hydrofluoric acid. So that means more trucks, more trains transporting sulfuric acid to refineries so they can make their product. Probably make it more likely that there will be a dangerous chemical accident than if we had just left these refineries alone to safely use hydrofluoric acid like they have been for years without any proven harm from an accident. Now, a lot of my Democrats, so according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, the refining industry has some of the lowest rates of incidents with non-fatal injuries and illnesses out of more than 500 manufacturing sectors, including as compared to any other major industrial sector. From the EPA's own data that it used to justify this proposal shows 0 off-site fatalities and only 1 incident that resulted in off-site property damage as a result of hydrofluoric acid. Also worth noting, it's used in basically everything. Only 2% of hydrofluoric acid demand is for the refining industry. So for all of this fear-mongering, there's 0 data whatsoever to support the claims of widespread negative health impacts from hydrofluoric acid. Both hydrofluoric and sulfuric acids have their risks, just like the chlorine we buy for our pools and the bleach we buy at Walmart. And just like everything else, they can be managed. Any rational human being knows this. By the way, the refineries that do this and use it, they do manage it. Their units are monitored 24 hours a day by individuals who undergo all sorts of training and accident simulation scenarios. They're equipped with high-sensitive lasers, chemical spot detectors, cameras, all of which trigger visual and audible alarms if any irregularity is found. If that happens, monitors can engage isolation valves to sequester the chemical within minutes. And there's cases where this happens, and there's been no dangerous outcomes as a result. So, look, this really comes down to the cost-benefit ratio in the time I have left here, which I'm running out of. it's a method to choke off oil and gas production. My bill stops that. The EPA can't place an outright ban on hydrofluoric acid units, so they're putting a rule out that can be used against refineries to shut them down completely and eventually. That was even admitted as so by the last hearing we had when the minority witness stated that the goal was indeed to shut them all down. And I wonder if the funders of his nonprofit are the ones who pay his gas bills. So if we want to keep our gas prices low, help our constituents, and keep these refineries online, we don't need to drag them down with these proposals, and my bill would stop that. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman recognizes Mr. Tonko from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I strongly oppose the gentleman's bill. H.R. 1155 would put workers at refineries at risk. I have a letter from the United Steelworkers that I respectfully ask be included in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. The United Steelworkers state, and I quote, "No industrial process risks more lives from a single accident than alkylation using hydrogen fluoride in oil refining." It goes on to say that exposure can damage the eyes, skin, nose, throat, respiratory system, and bones, can be inhaled or through a skin burn where it can cause death by cardiac arrest. The bill before us today maintains these unsafe conditions by letting refineries off the hook when it comes to looking at safer alternatives. Currently, refineries aren't required to change to one of the many safer alternatives in use today. They are simply required to look at safer alternatives and consider them. What is wrong with that? My Republican colleagues appear to think that knowing the truth about safety at a refinery is too big a pill to swallow. Congress should not block federal agencies from requiring highly hazardous facilities to assess those hazards and identify whether safer processes are possible to keep their workers safe. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting refinery workers who deserve a safe place to work by voting no on this bill. And with that, I thank you, Mr. Chair, and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else wish to speak
Mr. Chairman.
on the bill? Gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Fulcher, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Idaho, sorry about that.
I wish to strike the last word and speak in behalf of Mr. Crenshaw's legislation.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 1155 recognizes a key fact. There's two ways to deal with a hazard. You can either eliminate industry and eliminate it by stopping industry, or keep industry alive and manage the issue. The Biden administration's regulatory proposed rule kills industry, and H.R. 1155 manages the issue. The administrative regulatory proposal isn't practical for most Americans. Now, why is that? First, a plant technology and materials assessment, which is what the rule wants, only really makes sense if you're designing your refinery, not if you already have it operating. The mandatory assessment that the EPA wants affects about half of our existing domestic operating and refining capacity. There's only one proven alternative to hydrofluoric acid alkylation, and as Mr. Crenshaw pointed out, that's sulfuric acid. The cost, the risk, the volume is just much, much higher, and there's no evidence that it's safer. Either the refiners will spend hundreds of millions of dollars and make no changes, or a substantial portion of the U.S. refining capacity is going offline to change operations. H.R. 1155 prevents the government from forcing every one of the existing refineries that are permitted or operating from being forced to do these assessments, or, of course, they could do that on their own. For facilities that are in the design phase, they can either perform the technology and alternatives assessment that the EPA is calling for or in the proposed rule, or they can demonstrate to the EPA that their plant conforms to or will conform to the American Petroleum Institute's most recent version of recommended practice. That's API 751. So considering the practical permutations of this proposal and the fact that the general duty clause and other federal process and hazard assessment requirements apply, H.R. 1155 is the best way to put some sanity into the handling of this issue. Mr. Chairman, I support H.R. 1155 and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else wish to be? The gentlelady, Ms. Batagan.
Radical environmentalist was used to say that's who opposes this. As my colleague from New York pointed out, The United Steelworkers oppose H.R. 1155, and the last time I checked, the United Steelworkers were not radical environmentalists. And I want to quote from their letter on behalf of 850,000 members of the United Steel, Paper and Forestry, Rubber Manufacturing, Energy, Allied Industry, and Service Workers International Union. I write to urge you to oppose H.R. 1155, the Keeping America's Refineries Act. The United Steelworkers represents the great majority of workers in America's refineries, including the refineries that have hydrogen fluoride alkaline units. They have long advocated for the industry to transition. There's a lot of refineries. Only 2 are left that are using this. This is about safety. This is about keeping communities safe. So we can listen to all the rhetoric and all of the terms that are used to paint folks with broad strokes, but it's not fair to the United Steelworkers, and it's not fair to the men and the women who put their lives on the line every day in these refineries to do that. Instead, we should support efforts to minimize the risk of chemical accidents. We need to take actions to make our communities safer, not more vulnerable to chemical disasters. And that's why I rise to oppose this bill today. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Any others wish to speak? The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield such time as he may need to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw.
Thank you to the gentleman. I just want to address a few debate, but for it to be a debate, you got to address the points that I've made. I was told that it was just broad rhetoric, but nothing I said was broad at all. Stated very specific facts about, say, how many accidents have actually happened. Now, the point of that data, of course, is to point out that this is a solution in search of a problem that doesn't exist. We keep saying it's unsafe. Why? Well, we're not sure. It's just a chemical, so it's scary. That's broad rhetoric. I would like someone to actually address the arguments that were made. What happens when you take off 50% of refining capacity? Maybe only 2 refineries in California, but we're a big country. 50% of refining capacity is not nothing. It's significant. I bet we can't find a single steel worker that even knows what we're talking about right now. I'm sure that their leadership is opposed to it. We've been told that we've got to protect refinery workers. What about protecting their livelihoods? They live in my neighborhood. The people of color that you want to protect, they're my neighbors, and they work at these places. They talk about them in these broad strokes like they're, like it's some, I don't even know. These are my neighbors, left, right, across the street. I swear to you, that's true. They work at these places. They want their jobs. They're not worried about hydrofluoric acid because they're trained. They go through months and months of training to learn how to operate it safely. Nobody's addressed the alternatives. You say there's all of these alternatives. Like what? Well, we specifically stated what they were, sulfuric acid. And we specifically told you that it would require 3 times the amount of volume, which would require 3 times the amount of transportation, which, by the way, in the last few weeks, we've seen a lot of chemical spills from trains. Would anyone care to address that? We have 2 minutes and 45 seconds. If anyone would address on the other side who opposes this, those points I just made, I will yield that time. Oh, well, Gary Palmer will yield the time. If not, I yield back to my friend from Alabama. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. I would just add this, Mr. Chairman, and to my colleague from Texas. One of the things that has really undermined our economic and national security is the failure to upgrade and expand our hydrocarbon infrastructure. And if we continue down this path.
If not, are there any amendments? The question now occurs on forwarding.
Move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from New
Saying that only radical environmentalist is a broad sweeping statement. It's also offensive, I think, to the United Steelworkers to say there's probably not a single actual worker who believes this after having this letter submitted. So I think it's a little offensive, and I myself going to apologize to the United Steelworkers for comments that insinuate that this letter is false. And it's just offensive, first of all. So that's one of the broad strokes I was mentioning. The other one is, if California has been able to do it, other places can do it. And people care about their health care. People care about their health. So to suggest that if somebody has a job in an industry, all they care about is the job but not their health, I think is also disingenuous. Now, under this bill, a facility can't even look to see if there are ways to make their operations safer by using one of the many alternatives for hydrofluoric acid, because the author of this bill would rather we not burden chemical companies with the truth of the dangers that lie at their facilities. I'm hoping to use the rest of my time to ask some questions of council, if we could, to clear up the intent of this bill. Okay. This bill amends Section 112R of the Clean Air Act, which is the authority for the EPA's risk management program. Is that correct?
Congresswoman, the H.R. 1155 is called up, is a standalone piece of legislation. It does not amend the Clean Air Act.
Under the prior administrations. In this particular case, it was the Obama administration. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this bill and return to common sense on chemical safety. And I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. Are there any bipartisan amendments? Does anyone else wish to speak on the bill? Gentleman from Georgia.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I yield what time he shall consume to the gentleman from Texas, Representative Crenshaw.
Thank you to the gentleman, and thank you to the gentlelady for engaging with this. This is how Congress should work, so this is good. And I want to address very respectfully a couple of the points made. So one of the points was made that if California can do it, everyone can. The thing is gasoline, oil, petroleum, all of it, it's a global market. So if the state of California could stop all refining, it would have to be picked up somewhere in the U.S. So it's not a valid argument, just economically speaking. Also worth noting that the California policies haven't been so great to the people of California, driving electricity prices up 50% higher than the U.S. national average, causing disproportionate harm on low-income residents. The list goes on. And I would say, with respect to the workers, of course they want to go to work, but they also want to be safe. That's of course true. And so as policymakers, we have to weigh these costs and benefits. Because, look, I can keep somebody safe and keep them home forever, locked up, and guarantee that they'll never come in contact with anything dangerous in the outside world. Right? That's obviously the extreme end of that logic, but it's faulty logic. Now, if we're going to advocate for drastic change in a very, very important industry, such as refining, which every single American uses every single day, and they're very, very sensitive to the price of that gasoline, as we've seen in the last few years. If you're going to advocate for that drastic change, then you have to make a very compelling case that they're indeed in danger at these facilities. That case has not been made. I will happily go to your district. I've lived in California for 10 years. I grew up in the oil and gas industry. I'm from Houston. It's not like we don't know what a refinery looks like. And look, this specific explosion that you're talking about, there was, in California in 2015, in Torrance, there was 0 hydrofluoric acid released. 0. This entire argument is coming from a piece of shrapnel that almost hit a tank. That's where it's coming from. And in a case in what was it, Philadelphia, or in the other case where I mentioned it earlier, where hydrofluoric acid was released, it didn't hurt anyone. So this case has just not been made. We're potentially targeting 50% of America's refining capacity for nothing. We get no benefit from this. We're not saving anyone's lives because no one's life has been taken by this. That's a problem in just how we're thinking about this, and I think, and how we're acting as policymakers. And then I think that's a radical thing for our EPA to do.
Will the gentleman yield?
This bill stops. I'll yield. Well, I don't
Well,
have the power to
so-
yield. I don't have the power to yield. I yield back to my
Claiming
friend.
my time, and I'll yield to
Carter.
the gentlelady from California.
Well, you made a very interesting comment, and I would love your response to this. So are you saying because nobody has DiJet and there hasn't been an explosion, we shouldn't do anything about it when we know it's harmful? Because that's what you just said, and that's what doesn't make any sense to me. Why would we wait for an entire community to be exploded out and to be killed?
Understand.
Please clarify.
You have to yield.
Reclaiming my time, and I yield back to the gentleman for Texas, and I'm going to wear stripes next time.
Thank you. So we absolutely do something about it. In my commentary earlier, I listed the many things that take place at a refinery to make them safe. From the sensors and from the training, it is not like we do nothing. Again, we're having this conversation as if we're starting from year zero, where we've never regulated this before. But that's of course not true. We regulate it dramatically. What's more, every industry in the U.S. that uses hydrofluoric acid, they're subject to regulatory oversight from 6 different agencies. I'll list them: the EPA, OSHA, Department of Transportation, DHS, DOD, and local emergency planning committees. This is not an unregulated issue. It's not an unregulated industry. But that seems to be the starting point here. And we should start from an honest starting point and go from there. And I yield back.
And I yield.
The gentleman yields back. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Any amendments to the bill? The question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 1155 to the full committee. All that have been requested, the clerk will call the roll.
Rep. Carter. Rep. Carter votes aye. Rep. Palmer. Rep. Palmer votes aye. Balderson votes aye. Rep. Fulcher. Rep. Fulcher votes aye. Rep. Pfluger. Rep. Miller-Meeks. Rep. Obernolte. Rep. Obernolte votes aye. Rep. Rogers. Rep. Rogers votes aye. Rep. Johnson.
Johnson votes aye.
Rep. Johnson votes aye. Rep. Tonko.
No.
Rep. Tonko votes no. Rep. DeGette. Rep. DeGette votes no. Rep. Schakowsky. Rep. Schakowsky votes no. Rep. Sarbanes. Rep. Clark. Rep. Ruiz. Rep. Peters. Rep. Peters votes no. Rep. Badagan. Rep. Badagan votes no. Rep. Pallone. Rep. Pallone votes no.
The clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on that vote, there were 10 ayes and 6 nays.
The bill is agreed to. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the legislation approved by the subcommittee today. So ordered. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.